Staging Difficult Pasts. That is an opportunity for theater directors and museum curators to collaborate together on projects around memories of very difficult histories, where they are really grappling with different artistic strategies of representation. So I'm going to talk about a specific one. We have about 8 performances we're doing. I'm going to talk about one of them that happened last month in Krakow in Poland. And this project was meant to be a challenge to Diana Taylor's kind of smooth bifurcation between the archive as object, print, or material culture, and the idea of the repertoire as embodied acts of transfer. So we're interested in this intermediation of the body and the object as walking as a commemorative practice, and as the object as the condition of walking or of movement. We started with an object, with a very difficult, awkward object. So this particular object was made by a very famous Polish folk artist. You don't have to say his name again, it's Franciszek Wojciech. But the reason that he made the object is awkward. He made it as a toy for his children to play with. So his children would play with this object, and while they were playing with it, he would narrate his memories of the war. Which leads us to the question, is this an empathic object, or an object that produces empathy? The curators were really uncomfortable with putting these objects in an ethnographic museum, and so we talked about if we moved one of them, the Truposznica, if we moved it from a museum frame into a theatrical frame, if this would change the way we understood or interpreted the object. We brought this object to Cantor's theater, to Cantor's archive. We needed to think of a route, how to walk with this object from the ethnographic museum to Cantor's Krikoteka, to his theater. And in doing this, we had to cross a bridge. And it's a bridge that maybe some of you have seen before, if you've seen the film Schindler's List. It's the bridge that Jews had to cross when they were forced to leave their homes and move to the ghetto. And this bridge was destroyed, it was bombed during the war, but then it was perfectly reconstructed. And I think this is another question about the focus on architectural reconstruction is another way of erasing the visibility of the war and of the trauma that the war brings. We know that 7,000 to 8,000 Jews were murdered in the camp just outside of Krakow, and they were buried, and then they were exhumed, and the bodies were burnt by the Nazis when the Russians were arriving. And we don't know where they brought the ashes, but we think that they dumped them into the river, which makes the river a Jewish cemetery. So walking across this particular bridge with this particular object was a way of making this memory visible in the public, especially when many people who were still alive from the war claimed that they had never seen this truck, that it was a completely foreign object to them. How memory works and what we were doing, because this isn't the original object, this isn't the original truck. It's a kind of copy or a representation or an imitation. So if we think about memory, the relationship between memory and copying, we thought actually maybe what we need to do is reproduce this object as many times as we can. And the next question was, what are we commemorating with this object? So if I'm going to walk with this object across the bridge, so do I walk as a victim? Do I walk as a bystander? Or do I walk as a perpetrator? Actually, what this walk was going to do was to make us think a little bit about how easy it is to be in a position of perpetration and how quickly we can slide into forms of complicity. It also asks, is the bystander a passive role or is it a complicit role? We would give each person their own car and give them a string. They would have to tie the string themselves onto it and then pull it behind them. And the idea here is that in Poland, memory is always there. It's always just behind us. It's just at our backs. It's something, a kind of burden that we're constantly pulling, but we could take a moment to pull the burden together as a communal act. I think what this also did is that it opened up the possibility of identification at the expense of representation. And we know that representation is a problem. We know that. We know that the language of mourning is not our own. It's something that's given to us. And that in something like Holocaust memory, memory and representation of that memory is always overdetermined. One of the curators, who is the daughter of Polish Jews, made a comment at the end of the performance that stayed with me. She said that I carry the burden of this memory with me every time I come to the city, and I look around and it frightens me and it depresses me that other people are not sharing that burden with me. And she had said after this that today I had the opportunity to share that burden, to not to have to drag it along by myself. So for some of you, the burden may have felt heavy, but for me today, the burden actually felt a little bit lighter.